entire world is watching the presidential election in Iran for
Today's
signs
other
of
top story, what could be an historic opening with Iran.
With the U.S. and Iran on the brink.
bloodshed in the streets of Iran.
The mass protests in Iran are showing no signs of ending.
This is Iran Uncovered, a podcast by Nufti. And in Washington, D.C., I'm your host, Cameron Consarinia. The past 2 weeks in Iran have been a view into the life of its people for the past 41 years under the Islamic Republic. We've witnessed regime brutality and, in response, the immense bravery of the Iranian people. Against the backdrop of protests in the United States for racial justice, protesters against the Islamic Republic in Iran are being systematically rounded up across the globe and sentenced to death for partaking in peaceful protests. Last week, 3 young men, Amir Hossein, Saeed, and Mohammad, after days of torture, which included repeated beatings with electrical wire, were sentenced to death for the crime of warring against God because they partook in the November 2019 uprising against the regime. Days later, the Islamic Republic announced the execution sentences of 5 more peaceful protesters from the previous year's uprising. A video quickly spread on Persian-language social media showing one of these young men hugging his months-old daughter for the last time as regime security agents dragged him away. These men appear to be joining the list of the thousands the regime has already murdered in response to the people of Iran's ongoing protest movement. As they often have, however, the people of Iran are responding with immense bravery and defiance. Led by a war martyr's widow from the conservative religious city of Mashhad, Fatemeh Sepehri, a Persian-language hashtag, Do Not Execute, became Twitter's most used hashtag and brought immense internal and international pressure on the regime to halt the executions of Saeed, Mohammad, and Amir Hossein. Iranians also took to the streets in the southern city of Behbahan, chanting "Death to the Dictator" and "Reza Shah, bless your soul," before being confronted by security forces. These 2 weeks have been just that, merely 2 weeks in the lives of millions of Iranians for the past 4 decades. It's indicative of why for the past 3 years they've been in the middle of a nationwide uprising against that regime. Further supporting that uprising has been a decades-long campaign of crimes against humanity perpetrated by this regime against the people of Iran. To discuss that further, today we'll be joined by a preeminent Iranian human rights expert. I have to warn our listeners that because this episode will cover the gruesome crimes and practices of the Islamic Republic, some of the content may be disturbing and not appropriate for all listeners. Our guest today serves as the executive director of the Iran Human Rights Documentation Center. Having obtained his JD from Howard University School of Law and his LLM from Vermont Law School, he is the principal author of several IHRDC reports on Iran's LGBTQ community, women's rights, labor activism, ethnic minorities, freedom of expression, and much more. He's made it his life's work to stand up for the people of Iran and bring the crimes perpetrated against them to the forefront and ensure their voices are heard. I'm thrilled to be joined today by Shaheen Milani. Shaheen, welcome to Iran Uncovered, and thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Shaheen, the human rights situation in Iran under the Islamic Republic is frequently described as among the worst in the world, yet it seems that in many parts of the discourse, especially in the West, that isn't reflected. What makes the human rights situation in Iran so abhorrent?
Well, that's answering that question takes a lot of time. To start, I want to emphasize that the Islamic Republic, as many observers have noted, is like an ISIS that has been successful. By that, I mean that it's a state that is imposing Sharia law. Uh, it's enforcing Islamic mores on a society through force. And yet, it has been able, to some extent, to portray itself as a legitimate government, and even more problematically, as representative of the Iranian people. Although the Iranian government is not elected, and although it came to power after a popular revolution back in '79, it does no longer enjoy the support of the Iranian people, as they have demonstrated clearly in numerous demonstrations and protests, and as they have repeatedly shown that they dislike the government's policies, both back at home and abroad. So that's why it is such a difficult situation, because while the government's policies are truly abhorrent and its human rights abuses in Iran are truly abhorrent, it does not receive the same level of condemnation as I think it deserves.
And why is that? Is it because it portrays itself as a democratic government when indeed it is not, or are there other reasons?
Well, I mean, the Iran government, of course, has a successful propaganda campaign. That's a part of it. Another issue, I think, is the fact that it has portrayed itself as an anti-imperialist government, or rather an anti-imperialist movement, and therefore, unfortunately, a lot of people in the West and the rest of the world have turned a blind eye, I would say, to what is transpiring in Iran, perhaps because of their attitudes and their feelings with respect to the United States and the West in general. And I think your listeners have seen this, that there is some level of tolerance for authoritarian states that happen to be anti-American.
Right.
Somehow you see some praise for Castro. Sometimes you see, praise for even in some, extreme left. Sometimes you see support even for North Korea. Sometimes, so it's the same situation with Iran, and unfortunately, this is a phenomenon that we are all too familiar with.
You speak, Shaheen, about democracy quite often in the context of human rights. In our previous episode, we discussed the political structure of the Islamic Republic and how democracy is nowhere to be found therein. And that's mostly viewed as a political question. But when you and I were first discussing, you brought this up to me, and you view it quite differently. You view democracy not only as a political question, but as a fundamental human rights question. And why is that? Can you explain that a bit to us?
Well, here's the thing. It's not me that's saying it. It's the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. Article 25 of this convention, which Iran has signed and ratified, explicitly states that people have a right to free elections, and they have a right to elect their leaders through democratic means. So it's not me saying it. It is right there in the probably most important international human rights law instrument, the ICCPR. But unfortunately, the human rights discourse does not really talk about democracy as a right. And even, I think, ordinary people, and by ordinary I mean people who are not lawyers or who are not in the field of international law, uh, but they might not have this idea that they might not know that democracy and free elections are rights. They might see it as a luxury, as something that some people in the West might have and enjoy, but people in countries like Iran don't have it, and they might like it, but they don't frame it as a right. You see, when you talk about human rights, usually the images that comes to mind are political prisoners or torture,
Right.
or uh, shutting down newspapers or freedom of speech, or socioeconomic rights, right? So, of course, they're all of those are human rights and they must be discussed. Uh, but free elections on its own is a human right, and it is very important actually, because obviously, through the democratic process, through free elections, realization of other rights becomes much more easy, and it becomes easier to attain those rights, whether you're talking about individual liberties like freedom of expression, or you're talking about the right to health, or you know uh, the right to education. Of course, uh, democratic societies provide these rights much better than undemocratic societies provide them. So, having a having free elections and having a democratic system would be a great help for any society to achieve those other rights. But unfortunately, uh, the fact that democracy and free elections is a right enshrined in the ICCPR in Article 25 uh, is not something that's present in the human rights discourse. No, I've been to Geneva, to the Human Rights Council, and unfortunately, over there, uh, promotion of democracy somehow it's seen as a Western political agenda. It's seen as tied to global politics, but that's wrong. Uh, it's right there. It's a human rights, Article 25 of the ICCPR, and it must be treated as such, uh, regardless of what is happening politically. Uh, this shouldn't be affected by that. It should be impacted by that. And it's a change that I seek to uh, make happen in the human rights discourse.
In addition to the work that you do, ensuring that people understand more correctly the unique relationship between democracy and human rights, and indeed their interdependent nature, you also write and speak and research quite prolifically on another human rights issue in Iran, which is the discrimination, the systematic subjugation of religious minorities in Iran, from the Jewish population, which has been systematically depopulated by 90% since the Islamic Republic took over in 1979. I mean, the murder of Christian pastors, what has happened to the Baha'i community, a religion founded in Iran, and they have been denied government ID cards, denied places in universities, denied jobs, places in schools. I mean, just a treatment that one can only compare with the Nuremberg laws. Um, But for you, this is not only a professional commitment; it's also deeply personal. Would you mind, Shaheen, telling us a bit about your story and why this work means so much to you?
Sure, absolutely. I was born into a Baha'i family, and I did not meet my father because before I was born, when my mom was pregnant with me, my father was arrested and perhaps summarily executed by the Iranian government and the Revolutionary Guards in on August 21, 1980. My father, who was a member of the National Spiritual Assembly of the Baha'is of Iran, along with 10 others, they were arrested uh, and we don't know what happened to them. Uh, the Iranian government never took responsibility, and they never announced, what had happened to them. What we do know is that uh, the government, they also arrested and executed the group who uh, basically succeeded uh, my father and his colleagues. They executed them in 1981, and then they arrested and overall uh, the Iran government executed or killed more than 200 Baha'is.
Shaheen, when the regime is just killing 200 members of a religious minority, are they charging them with anything? Or are they? I know sometimes they're given trumped up, ridiculous charges of espionage. Sometimes they're charged with literally a religious offense. Were these individuals? I know in your father's case, regrettably, we don't have an answer. But for those thereafter, were they charged with anything, or were they simply just killed?
Um, in some cases, they're just assassinated, but most were arrested and tried uh, in summary trials, brief trials, and charged with baseless crimes like spying for Israel or acting against the state, or you name it. At that time, these laws were not uh, even clearly uh, defined. Uh, and the trials were secret in many cases. It wasn't that or and these individuals were not afforded lawyers or any sort of a legal process that you can talk about. Uh, they were just mostly accused of being spies for Israel or other similar baseless national security crimes. Um, so yes, that's my story. I never met my father, and we don't know what happened to him. We presume that uh, he and the others who were arrested with him, they were executed. But how they were killed and where they're buried, we don't know. And I left Iran when I was 16, and I came to the United States as a refugee um, because Baha'is are not allowed to attend Iran's state-run university system. Um, so that was the main reason that I left Iran.
Wow, I I I really don't know what to say to such a travesty, except how sorry I am. But so thankful to you that you have used this absolute tragedy to raise the voices of others, to stand up for others like yourself, like your family, who have been subjected to the abject cruelty of the Islamic Republic. But I know, Shaheen, that in addition to defending the rights of Baha'is in Iran, which in and of itself, given what they're subjected to, could be a 24/7 job. At the Iran Human Rights Documentation Center, you all are tireless in raising the case of other groups, other oppressed individuals and categories of individuals in Iran. One of those in particular is the LGBTQ community. In the West, I think one of the things that we've been witness to over the past decade has been the real strides that have been taken towards LGBTQ equality. Needless to say, there's room to grow. But in Iran, that hasn't been the case. If anything, it's gotten worse. Would you mind telling us a bit about the status of the LGBTQ community in Iran and what they're faced with under the Islamic Republic?
Uh, um, well, first, thank you for your very kind words. The situation of LGBT community in Iran is, of course, is very dire, I would say. Iran is one of a few countries that actually has the death penalty for homosexual relations. Under Iranian law, sodomy is punishable by death, and they have a bizarre system, bizarre code. The Islamic Penal Code is called, and it was lastly revised in 2013. In the latest version, the two parties who commit sodomy, they divide it into the passive partner and the active partner. And the passive partner gets the death penalty anyway, and the active partner gets the death penalty only if he's married. If not, he'd get 100 lashes. For same-sex relations between women, it's just the women who are convicted of same-sex relations are flogged again, 100 lashes. It is, I must add, it is difficult to prove sexual crimes under Islamic law. You have to have 4 witnesses, but the government can also secure a conviction if a defendant confesses 4 times. And we did have a case that a lesbian woman was brought in court. And they put pressure and torture people to force them to confess. But this one was forced to confess 4 consecutive times in court, and then she was sentenced to flogging. So actually executing people for same-sex acts is rare. It doesn't happen that often. I think the last case that I know of was in 2011. But apart from that, they can also charge them with lesser crimes, like disturbing, public opinion, or immoral acts, or actually, I think, if I remember correctly, sexual relations excluding adultery or sodomy are are punishable um, by imprisonment. I think I don't remember exactly at the moment. But so LGBT people are routinely harassed and arrested for being who they are.
And as the number of executions of members of the LGBTQ community that we know of seems to be plateauing, one thing that activists in this space, those who focus particularly on the LGBTQ community in Iran, focus on and discuss is the issue of gender reassignment surgery and forced gender reassignment surgery, and that the regime has substituted forced gender reassignment surgery or heavily incentivized gender reassignment surgery for these executions, and that basically they will have a gay couple, two men say, and force or heavily incentivize one of them to have a gender reassignment surgery such that it's now a heterosexual couple. One activist in this space refers this as a campaign to cleanse the country of its LGBTQ population. What can you tell us about this practice and more generally some of the systematic oppression that they face in Iran?
Yes, you mentioned a very important point. Under Islamic law, say, sex reassignment surgery is permissible, and actually Khomeini himself issued a fatwa in 1980s to a transgender woman, and basically these operations have been taking place in Iran for several decades, and the government actually, in some cases, subsidizes them. And for them, that's the solution. That's their solution to the problem of homosexuality. They see it as a problem, and then they incentivize these procedures. And unfortunately, a lot of mental health professionals suggest this to their patients who are who are not transgender, who are just simply gay or lesbian, and they don't tell them that it's okay to be gay or lesbian. Instead, they tell them that okay, you need to have a sex reassignment surgery. And I interviewed for a report that we wrote on LGBT rights back in 2013. I recall interviewing individuals who were homosexual, and they had experienced this. They had mental health professionals tell them that you need to undergo sex reassignment surgery. And after they had, in this particular case that I remember, after she had started therapy, and then at some point she left Iran and came to Canada. When we were interviewing, at that point, she told me that she didn't think that she was transgender, and she was reconsidering continuing the therapy or going through with the with surgery or anything like that. So that's that's a very concerning issue. Another very sad situation is that when an LGBT person is abused at home, they do not have any recourse. They cannot go to the authorities and file a complaint, because if they go and then they say that okay, my father, for example, hit me, because I'm gay, then they've incriminated themselves, you know.
Mm-hmm.
So that's a very troubling situation, because you know in a lot of cases, uh, these individuals, the primary source of harm for them is their families and the
Right.
pressure they undergo at home. But then the state not only doesn't provide them with any protection, but if they go to the state, they would be persecuted further. Um, you know, that's a very sad situation. And also, another note I would like to add is that with respect to honor killings, it also can happen to uh, gay individuals, like even like gay men. It's not something that
Hmm.
only happens to women. It can happen to gay men. And under Iranian law, uh, a father who kills his children cannot be put to death, because under Islamic law, he is the owner of uh, his children's blood, as to, you know, to literally translate it. And as such, the father cannot be put to death. So if a father, you know, kills his son because his son is gay, uh, the maximum penalty for him would be 3 to 10 years imprisonment. So the maximum he could get is 10 years in prison, uh, and that depends on it's contingent on the court finding that this person poses a threat to the society. You know, so it's not even
Wow.
guaranteed.
In addition to the crimes against LGBTQ persons and that persecution, something that you've written extensively about, that the Human Rights Documentation Center has covered extensively in various reports, is the legal and systematic discrimination against women. One women's rights activist refers to this as the gender apartheid in Iran. Can we discuss a bit about that and the status of women under the Islamic Republic in Iran?
You're absolutely right. You know, the law is so backward and so I don't know how to describe it. Cruel. That is really shocking. Under Iranian law, rape is not a separate crime. I want to repeat that again. Under Iranian law, rape is not a separate crime. Rather, it is a subcategory of adultery or fornication. Okay?
Wow.
So, as such, because you know it is not seen as a crime against a person, it is seen as a crime against, you know, religious law, against, you know, God's law. You know, because it is that way. Uh, Under Iranian law, adultery and fornication, if somebody commits it, they can repent to a judge, and then they would not receive uh, the stoning or lashing, depending on the circumstances. So under Iranian law, rape, you know, uh, is a subcategory of fornication or adultery. It is punishable by death. However, if somebody repents before a judge and the judge accepts that repentance, uh, he would be sentenced instead to between 6 months and 2 years of imprisonment for rape. So, on one hand, somebody could be put to death for rape, but if a judge accepts that person's repentance, he could be sentenced to 6 months in prison. Okay,
Wow.
and when I was describing, uh, I explicitly used the male pronoun. I said he could be sentenced to death or 6 months to 2 years. I didn't use she, and there's a reason for it. Because under Iranian law, rape is explicitly uh, it can only happen, if there is penetration by a man uh, to a woman or to another man. That would be sodomy. But a woman cannot commit rape. Okay, because of their traditional notion and traditional definition of
Sure.
of what rape is. And more troubling is that uh, short of rape, uh, there is no uh, sexual assault crime. Okay, and sorry to be a bit graphic, but it is important to note this, and it's important for your listeners to know what happens when a society is governed by Islamic law. Under their definition, rape only happens when there's penetration by a penis up to more, if the penetration is more than the point of circumcision. Okay, but if the penetration is by anything else, it's a digital or it's by a metal rod or whatever sort of violence that you can imagine, that's not rape under Iranian law. Okay, and since there is no sexual assault law, okay, any type of sexual violence that can happen, if it doesn't involve penetration by man's penis, it doesn't constitute rape. And there's no sexual assault, it doesn't constitute sexual assault. It can only be prosecuted as just battery, as if, or uh, alternatively, it could be prosecuted as a lesser sexual immoral act. So, and let's say that, to give an example, uh, kissing, right, by two unmarried people is prohibited, right? Uh,
Mhm.
and it's punishable by law. I have to. I don't recall exactly what the punishment is at the moment, but uh, basically, if you have a violent uh, sexual assault against somebody, if it doesn't meet the technical, and by technical I really mean very technical definition of rape under their law, the punishment for the most heinous sexual crime is exactly the same as a punishment for consensual kissing.
Hmm.
Okay,
Hmm.
because uh, because the mental state of the victim is not important under the law. It doesn't matter that the victim consented or not. Okay, the only difference that it makes is that, of course, the victim, if it's not consensual, the victim wouldn't be punished, of course. But as to what happens to the perpetrator, it doesn't make a difference whether it's kissing or whether it's a violent sexual assault. That's very disturbing. That there is under Iranian law, uh, the punishment for even for rape, again, if the uh, perpetrator repents, he could get as few as 6 months in prison. And if the crime doesn't involve the technical definition of rape, uh, which is penile penetration more than the point of circumcision, it really isn't a sexual crime or sexual assault. It is not prosecuted as such. So we really have a horrible situation.
So law in the Islamic Republic in Iran does seemingly everything it can to protect the perpetrators of violent crime, specifically violent, heinous sexual crime against women. But the Islamic regime is not a stranger to violence. We recently read a report that those arrested for protesting in the November 2019 uprising, many of them were forced to make confessions because they were threatened with sexual violence against their family members. They were threatened with the notion that security forces would rape their girlfriends, for example, if they did not confess. You've spoken about the widespread use of torture, both in prison under this regime and as a form of punishment. What can you tell us about violence and physical torture as a means of punishment under the Islamic Republic?
Wow. I would like your listeners to know that the Iranian government still amputates fingers for the crime of theft. Every year, a few people face this punishment. Just, I think it was last year, a man was convicted of stealing sheep in Khorasan province in Iran's northeast, and his fingers were amputated. And floggings, of course, are routinely performed for the crimes of drinking alcohol. Also, under Article 638 of the Fifth Book of the Islamic Penal Code, if a person drinks water or food in public during the month of Ramadan, they could be flogged up to 74 lashes. So even for 1 month a year, just eating and drinking in public could end up, a person who eats or drinks in public could end up being flogged. So of course, these punishments are all prohibited under the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, to which Iran is a party. But unfortunately, they do take place. Iran actually has a specific regulatory code on how to carry out these punishments, and we have translated this code. It is available on our website. Its title is really self-explanatory. It says the regulatory code on stoning, qisas, amputations, and the like.
Wow.
You can look it up on our website, and it explains in gruesome detail, what are the exact procedures of carrying out these punishments. Stoning is provided for under the Islamic Penal Code as punishment for adultery. It hasn't been carried out in recent years. I think it's been 7 or 8 years, perhaps, that it hasn't been carried out. I'm not sure when was the last time it was carried out, but it is still possible to execute people for that. It's just that they've put a moratorium on it. They're not carrying it out because of international pressure, but it is available as a punishment. And yeah, so you have it, stoning, amputation, uh, flogging, and of course public executions. Uh, you know, they they actually carry out public executions, and you can see these horrible pictures of little children coming out to see these uh, public executions. And they usually carry them out like 4 or 5 in the morning, and you see these scenes of people gathering in a public square to witness an execution. It is really gruesome, but unfortunately, that's the reality of Iranian life right now.
Shaheen, thank you. You've given us this disturbing but necessary view into life for the people of Iran under the occupation of the Islamic Republic. Are there any final notes that our listeners should take home with them about the human rights situation in Iran?
I just wanted to add shortly, as the final point, uh, mentioning how the Islamic Republic is an ISIS that has become acceptable, unfortunately. Another practice that happens in Iran, and almost nobody talks about it. Nobody, even it's rarely discussed in the UN mechanisms. And I've raised this issue in the Human Rights Council. Is the issue of imprisonment of debtors. So, and actually, they comprise the largest number of prisoners in Iran. In 2018, there were 18,000 people imprisoned in Iran for failure to pay a debt or financial obligation, and
Wow.
that includes people who don't have insurance, and they may have injured or killed someone in an accident, and then they cannot pay the blood money, the dia, as they say. It includes men whose wives have asked for the traditional mehriya, and it's a sum that a husband promises to pay his wife at upon the wife's request. And many people promise to pay sums that they don't have because they're in love and they make these promises. But then when the marriage hits turbulent waters, and the woman demands to have the mehriya, then some of these men, they don't have the money to pay, and so they end up in prison. And also includes people who just who've gone bankrupt. Recently, a person, Iran's I think longest serving prisoner of for financial debt. He was a factory owner, apparently, who had gone bankrupt and had spent 20 years in prison. 20 years.
Wow.
And in that situation, you can only get released if you either pay your creditors, or if the creditors withdraw their complaint against you. So, and this is an issue that unfortunately doesn't get any coverage because it's not very attractive. Maybe there's no constituency that would push for change, and frankly, it's a gross violation of it's a clear violation of Article 11 of the ICCPR, and many people don't know this. Under international law, this practice of imprisoning people for debt is categorically forbidden under Article 11 of the ICCPR. But unfortunately, this hasn't been addressed. In my meetings with the UN Special Rapporteur, Dr. Rahman, I've brought it up. I've mentioned it to him that this has happened, and I will continue to push for it. I hoped, and I actually gave it the first time that I was able to give a speech at the Human Rights Council. In 2019, I gave a speech and I raised this issue, and I hope that it is picked up by the Iran's human rights community and others, and this gross injustice is addressed.
It's tragic, it's barbarous, it's gruesome, it's abhorrent. I mean, none of these descriptors are sufficient. None of them do justice in describing what's happening in Iran. I think you put it best, Shaheen, in saying that the Islamic Republic is like ISIS, but with oil revenues, with a state, with an army, with a judicial branch. I mean, that's what it is. But because of the bravery of the people of Iran in standing up, because of the perseverance and the support of people like you, Iranians far from home, who, despite immense personal loss, despite having family members stolen from you unjustly, you stand up, you push back, you ensure that the crimes that are done against the people of Iran are not unheard, are not unseen. The people of Iran have a voice, and so thank you. Thank you for joining us today. Thank you for all the work that you do, that you and your colleagues at the Iran Human Rights Documentation Center do, and that I know that you'll continue to do. And I hope we'll have the pleasure of talking to you once again. Thank you, Shaheen. Thank you for joining us on our third episode of Iran Uncovered, brought to you by Nufti. Continue to follow us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and our website, www.nuftiran.org. We'll see you next time.